I'm Lauren Acker. The title of my paper is The Rural-Urban Divide and Belief in America First, a Logistic Regression Analysis. And this was completed last fall in a statistical modeling course at Grinnell College. So first I'll go through the background, then move into data and methods, then the results section, and move into discussion. So the paper really came about based on the 2016 presidential election. We noticed that there was a lot of news coverage and think pieces focusing specifically on rural voters and how Donald Trump came into office because rural voters did not feel valued by mainstream politics. And there's some evidence that there is some truth in that statement. Increased globalization has financially benefited urban areas and diverted resources from rural populations. And in turn, people in cities do tend to hold more globalist views than those in rural areas. So perhaps capitalizing on this sentiment, Donald Trump did espouse the phrase America First multiple times throughout his campaign. And that success perhaps helped resonate very strongly in rural areas, especially compared to his Republican predecessors. So looking at this information, that led us to ask the question, is there a relationship between place of residence and identification as a believer in America First? And based on the existing literature, we expected that those in rural areas would be more likely to identify as believers in America First compared to those in urban areas. The data that was collected was gathered from the Grinnell College National Poll, and that was in 2018 that was collected from phone interviews from 1,000 adults across the United States. The interviewers asked questions to respondents on issues related to politics and also collected demographic information on the respondents. So we use a multiple logistic regression model to specifically examine the relationship between current residents and self-identification as a believer in America First. So the response variable was that subject's self-identification as a believer in America First. So an interviewer asked the respondent, do you believe in America First? And if that response was recorded as yes or no in the data. And then for residents, that could be recorded as city, suburb, small town, and rural. And we included a number of control variables such as education, age, religion, race, income, and gender to prevent potential omitted variable bias. I know it's a little wonky at the top, but that is the full model. And assumptions, we believe that we met the assumptions of a logistic regression model. The response variable is binary. We ran a variance inflation factors test, which indicated no multicollinearity between the predictors. All the observations are independent of one another. There are no outliers in the data, and we have a relatively large sample size. Moving into the results, we did find that there was a significant relationship between residents and self-identification as a believer in America First. And in the analysis, we used city as the baseline to calculate odds ratios for the other three types of residences. So that means that we use city as the basis of comparison. So you see rural areas are 2.3 times more likely to identify as a believer in America First than residents of cities, which follows our hypothesis. Additionally, people in small towns are 1.5 times more likely to identify as a believer in America First than residents of cities. And that's not significant at the 0.05 level, but you can see the p-value is very close. So we did include that here. And then suburbs, those in suburbs are actually 1.6 times less likely to identify as a believer in America First than residents of cities. We explore this result more in the discussion section. And looking at just the raw data from the poll, this just shows how the respondents in each location responded to the question as to whether or not they identified as a believer in America First. You can see that generally as a place gets more urban, less respondents identify as a believer in America First, except for the suburb location where it's almost split 50-50. But in each location, the majority do identify as believers in America First. So just in summary again, the analysis does show that there's a relationship between current residents and self-identification as a believer in America First when controlling for a number of factors. And that our hypothesis is supported that rural people are 2.3 times more likely to be a believer in America First than those in cities. But the result for suburban respondents does not match our hypothesis. We do want to note that no causality can be inferred because there may be an endogenous relationship between those where you come from and your beliefs. So for example, you can say where you come from can influence your identity, but also I can have a belief in America First and want to move somewhere where that matches my belief. So we cannot say that the causality of that relationship. Additionally, the data was collected through phone surveys, which can have potential selection bias, and to account for that, we put in weights for the data to be more representative of the American population. And we do believe the data set is fairly large, which is meets the reasonableness of the assumptions of the model. So going into the question that I presented earlier, why are participants in suburbs the least likely to identify as a believer in America First? Well, we didn't use the source that I'm listing below in the paper originally because it just came out this month or in October. And I think it provides a great explanation potentially as to why we see this result. So the New York Times analysis, they note that educated people are moving into inner ring suburbs, and that in our analysis, we note that education does have a negative relationship with America First. So the more educated you are, the less likely you are to identify with that, that belief. And particularly historically, white people do vote Republican, but now there is becoming a fissure between educated white people and non-educated white people, and educated white people are moving away now from the Republican Party. Additionally, racial minorities are moving into inner ring suburbs, and racial minorities tend to vote Democratic. And so we see the inner ring suburbs are becoming more Democratic, while the outer ring suburbs are becoming more conservative, but the outer ring suburbs are losing population, so in turn suburbs are becoming more generally Democratic. And so here's a snapshot of the article of a specific place in Grand Rapids, Michigan, that this is the case. So you can see in an urban area, it's remained pretty blue from 1996 to 2016. Inner suburbs, the East Grand Rapids has flipped blue, and then the outer suburbs and rural areas have turned almost completely red. So there's more of that polarization between density and non-dense areas. So increasingly dense areas become increasingly more blue, and then less dense areas are more starkly red. So that was just an interesting analysis, I think provides some context for the results we see. So here are references. Thank you. If you have any questions.
Wonderful, Lauren. Thanks so much. All right, so we did have a question from Andrew Schaffner. He was wondering about how the weights were chosen in the model.
Sorry, I didn't catch that. What was the question?
He was wondering how the weights were chosen in your model that you built.
Sure. So actually, Ann Seltzer and company, they initially put in the weights. So initially, there were much more older people than younger people represented in the data. So the weights were placed on younger people specifically. And so their response is more, I guess, amplified within the data, but to be more representative of the United States population.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And one last question. So someone was wondering what aspect of this project was most exciting to you?
I think that getting the unexpected result was really interesting. Of course, it's great to see such a strong, significant response for your hypothesis, but I think looking into the suburbs and then leading into a part of my research that I wasn't expecting that's actually being asked of current campaigns is really fascinating because, you know, a lot of Democratic candidates are trying to get a suburban vote, and understanding that vote better and then doing research and seeing that in my own research is really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, thanks so much, Lauren.